As you know, I'm from Mexico, but I live in London now. I've been there for about 20 years. I teach in a arts university there, which is called St. Martin's. And I've been working on themes of science and technology for about 10 years now. The way it all started was with a space exploration project. And it started with this project that is called the Mars One mission. I got a grant to develop a book through the Photographers Gallery in London. And it was very quickly that I became I used the theme of a space to bring back the attention to the Earth. And I realized how little within the space exploration mythology we have ecological dialogues. And furthermore, how the state of mind of some scientists is about kind of taking the eyesight from the Earth and looking to other places. So within all of these, I discovered that I have indigenous heritage. I discovered this through my grandma, through a photograph she shows me. And with this discovery, a lot of post-colonial and decolonial questions came to me. There's still a lot of, unfortunately, discrimination against indigenous communities and indigenous culture in Mexico, and I think this is the case in the majority of the world. So it was almost like my grandma backtracked and didn't want to feel, or couldn't even feel proud about that heritage. And so that made me question, and that made me probe into ideals of progress, contemporary Western progress, because I live in London and I live in between these two worlds, right? And so now at the point in which I am, almost 10 years after, is this film that I'm presenting as part of the festival that is called Earthless. It was originally launched in Boston for an exhibition that was called Infinitude. And Infinitude covered this notion of nature being there for human beings to control and own. So in a way, the film that I developed opens the question of ownership versus, or in comparison to, stewardship. What does it mean? Can we even control nature? When can we accept the fact that we are so small and we are so small part within nature? When are we going to kind of embrace humbleness? When are we going to kind of embrace other forms of thinking, other forms of life, and other forms of naming the world even? And this is where indigenous thought and the language that I'm speaking now comes in. Because within my research, I discovered that English is the language of science, becomes the language of science because of Charles Darwin, and because of all these scientific imperialist projects that exist. No? And as the language of science then proclaims the future, right? So English is the language of the future, and science that is owned by English is the language, is who owns the future. So at this point, thinking of an ecological disaster in which we find ourselves in, all of a sudden, I think we are all thinking, and the coronavirus and all of what has happened, right? We are all thinking, whose future is this, right? What are we going to do? How are we going to do better? And I think in a way, the future is ancestral. I think there's the indigenous knowledge that has been left as a knowledge of the past is incredibly relevant. It has always been present. It has evolved, but we haven't given the space nor the recognition that it deserves. And we're at a cross points in which we have to do things differently. So in a way, the film that I'm presenting here is a very small abstract of a longer project, but that's partially what it's trying to do. It's trying to open up these questions and these conversations. As I was talking before with a researcher that actually works in UCL, University College London, we were saying that you have to make disruptions from the center, right? So in a way, I know I'm in the West, and I know, I work there and I talk this visual language from the West, but now trying to find my own decolonial vocabulary is creating very interesting tension. And I'm embracing that tension because I don't think we have, or we won't have clear answers like that. It's something that we need to work out, and it's like something that will happen eventually. But we do need to have these disruptions and these conversations started because we need to begin from somewhere. We were talking about the use of language and the importance of the use of language in my work, or at least in this project. I'm using Nahuatl, which is an indigenous, disappearing, unfortunately, dialect. They call it dialect, but it's language in Mexico. And the reason for doing that is how I want to question the notion of who owns knowledge, who claims ownership on knowledge, and by claiming ownership on knowledge, who claims the future, in a way. So in this sense, I think that because historically and historical tradition with science, we have had discoveries throughout history in which English has been the language of science and knowledge, is that then English is somehow the representative of the future. And because I'm interested in ecological thought and creating new visual vocabularies for this era in which we find ourselves in, is that I thought introducing a different language that is considered the language of the past. I thought that by introducing Nahuatl, in a way, I'm opening the question of why do we consider this the language of the past, and how is that we can start even having new conversations if we keep on speaking the same language, right? So this new era of ecological disaster that I'm talking about is an era in which I think perceptually we start looking at things more alive, like glaciers. I have a glacier that is part of the exhibition, and in a way is the symbol of nature becoming more alive. And it's not that it wasn't alive, it's that it suddenly is becoming alive, more alive in our eyes, because it's biting back in a way. And it's saying, here I am, and I'm this unstoppable force, and I'm huge, and I'm overpowering, I'm everything. So these are kind of the elements with which I'm playing. On one hand side is the language, and the new visual vocabulary is question who owns the future, and it's also finding different ways of expressing this new visual vocabulary. So in the case of the exhibition here, I'm using drawing, because drawing in itself is a different discipline. What drawing demands is a different part of your brain, first of all, but the process of drawing is all about seeing. You draw what you choose to see. And so the fact that I've drawn just the little top of the iceberg, which is normally the dominant point of view, I drew it tiny in comparison to what is all the way underneath, is on one hand side questioning our eyesight, and is also kind of opening the conversation of there's so much more underneath the surface that we do not see. I thought the drawing as a discipline was the only pertinent discipline to use of what I was mentioning in terms of seeing, but also the process of drawing is almost like bringing the image into existence. You draw line by line, and then the further back you position yourself, the more the drawing makes sense. I don't know if you've noticed, but usually with paintings and drawing and so on, if you go really close, the less it looks like the thing itself that is supposed to look like. And so it is an interesting process in terms of not putting too much information, putting just the basic information of a shape so your brain registers it, but then also putting enough highlights so the thing becomes three-dimensional. It's a very interesting process, and I think in a way people appreciate that when they see the line and they see the different thickness of the line, and then suddenly they kind of see the whole image. I think even though if we cannot articulate it as an audience who do not draw, is something that on a perceptual level registers, because it's the way you're reading the information, it's the way your brain is reading the information, and so the way in which the image goes inside is a completely different way, I think, than a photograph or a video or even sound. The next layer, talking about perception within the work, is that in a way it's not only questioning about what our eyesight see and its limits in a way, and the limits of photography itself, but it's also kind of trying to activate sound, and it's trying to activate other layers of information. So in a way, it's saying in this new era that we find ourselves in, images are not going to be enough. We need to engage all of our senses when engaging with nature. We need to engage our hearing and our touch and our smell. We need to engage here and now with the world in a different way. And we are so inundated with images today that I think it's very important to start activating those kind of conversations and spaces, and in exhibitions, which is what I do. So in a way, the reason for using new technologies is because as an indigenous woman of color, someone that speaks and looks like me is never expected to be talking about these very Western, very male subjects, right? That was one of the reasons I discovered until later. The initial reason for which I started using augmented reality is because I'm very aware of the limit of the frame when you take a photo. And you become really aware of what it doesn't go into the frame, but that nevertheless is contextualizing the image and is informing the way in which you are reading the image. So I was really interested in finding ways of including that somehow for the audience, right? Because I'm always interested in what is left outside the frame, but that nevertheless I know contextualizes the image and informs the way in which we read the image, and we build up the story of the image. I'm always interested in finding a way for the audience to access that what is being left out, right? Which can be a historical context, which can be a lawmaking context, which can be a human rights context, and so on. And so I started using augmented reality with space exploration project that I had before. And what I used it for was to talk about less glamorous issues, like space law. Space law is so boring. How do you bring up that at the moment there's no legal framework to talk about who's owning the space, right? We have a law that was drafted in just after the Second World War, and so it just talks about nation states. It doesn't talk about corporations at all, and who's doing the space race today or is making it possible is corporations. So there's no legal framework that says Elon Musk cannot go to the moon and say the moon is mine. And so what is going to happen with that, right? So in a way, I think I use augmented reality to access something like that in a more kind of interesting and engaging way for the audience. Uppermost, for a younger audience, they have the mobile. The kids today is like second nature to them, and I thought it was a very good way of gaining access to that. They are going to be the generation that is going to be confronting these issues, right? So I think it's very important to kind of engage them in these type of conversations from now. Yes.
And to, I think, just sort of wrap up our discussion, if you could briefly talk about the two still images that you had put in the installation. So
yes.
On the left of the channel was the head of a rabbit,
yes,
encased in a sort of enclosure, and on the right is, I think it's you,
yes,
on the landscape, and
yes,
there's also certain data that is transposed onto the image, and there are certain registers of what seems to be at least mimicking perhaps data
yes,
that's transposed onto the images.
Yes.
So if you could sort of talk about both of these things,
yes,
also in context of the video
yes,
channel,
yes,
and then we can just wrap
yes. Wow, that's complicated. Okay, so the rabbit in itself is a commentary on Western way of producing knowledge and owning and controlling nature. Is this idea that nature is there to be owned and measured, so that in a way links with the data drawings that you see on the other image. Is this continuation into the new technologies that we have today, into classifying everything and measuring everything, including nature, but also is a commentary of capital as well, and how money is so intertwined with natural resources today. The graph that you see on the other image is a copy from algorithms that have been produced since 2018, more or less, to make more money faster, more efficiently. And so then what has happened is that with these algorithms, they produce flash crashes. They are so quick in making these transactions that then a regular crash that would happen in the stock exchange happens within milliseconds. And so the only ones that are aware of this are the computers that are producing it, not even humans. And because there were many flash crashes happening one after the other, is that humans notice them. And so then there's an organization that started studying these and visualizing them. And so then I grabbed some of those graphs and put them on the drawing of this natural landscape, because I think that in a way capitalism is affecting ecology today, and as I said, it's very intertwined with natural resources. The figure that is me is a beekeeper, and the reason for that is that throughout my work for the past 10 years, I keep on relating space exploration with the bees being at the center of the ecological balance. And so she is this botanist that is kind of finding new ways or indigenous ways of studying what Western culture wouldn't necessarily study, and is kind of appropriating back some of the knowledge that has been taken away and that has been erased and has not been acknowledged. Again, is opening those conversations of, is there a different way of studying nature, which for me wouldn't necessarily be studying it. That's why she's holding the log. It's almost like, again, the concept of stewardship, right? We are responsible. We do not own. We are here passing by. We are not eternal. And so what we need to do is just to take care of what we have already here, right? Which brings me back to the idea of language and knowledge. One of the concepts that I've discovered in Nahuatl that doesn't exist in English as a single word, it talks about this idea of contentment, of realizing that you have already enough, of not having to grow eternally, of realizing there's abundance. And it's interesting because when I first came across it, within the context of my Western life in London, I thought of abundance as almost like accumulation, right? Of like, let's have more. And the more I researched, the more I discovered that it was completely the opposite. That it was about, you already have enough. You don't need more. You don't need to keep on growing. And in a way, that's like the nutshell or at the center of the video installation. It's like, we already have enough. Why do we have to go to the moon? Why do we have to go to Mars? Let's take care of what we have here now, because it's fragile, it's unique, it's incredible, it's perfect for us to thrive in. Why are we wanting more? And where is that taking us? I mean, so the main question that I want to ask is like, who are we going to let keep owning the future? How do we own the future in a different way?